exactly 7. We got a brief intro for you all. So thank you all for joining us today for the intermediate and advanced class Zoom session, and then the field session will be this weekend. All of you should have received a handout for this class. If you haven't received it, put it in the chat that you haven't received it, and I can email it to you. I am Sheridan Alford, the Director of Community Engagement at Burge, Georgia. And just a few housekeeping notes. So we are recording today's webinar, and we'll email the link to the recording out to everybody that's registered within the next 7 to 10 days. You can also enable the closed captions for this webinar by clicking closed captioning. It's a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will have time for the Q&A at the end of the webinar, but also feel free to put your questions in the chat. Jennifer will be moderating for us today for those questions. You can also put them in the Q&A box. So there's a couple different places, but we can see them all. So yeah, this year marks our 10th annual Georgia Bird Fest. Your participation in Georgia Bird Fest directly supports Burge, Georgia's conservation, education, and community engagement programs. So we greatly appreciate it. So we were talking about just a second ago, this is the coast into the end of this year's events and getting ready for next year's events. So I'm excited to host today's webinar, and we'll now turn things over to you all's great instructor, Eric Bowles. And yeah, again, please put questions in the chat.
Okay. Hey, Sheridan. Thank you very much. Hey, everyone. Let me go ahead and set up screen share. Okay, Sheridan, how's it look?
Looks good to me. I can see.
Okay, good. Okay. I've got a lot of material here, and there's also a bit more in your handout. What I try to do is go ahead and get you the handout so you're not having to spend all your time taking notes. So you actually got the content that's on the slides. You can think about or listen. Think about and listen and kind of pay attention to what we're talking about here. Feel free to ask questions at any time along the way. I can handle it. Jen's there to keep an eye on the chat. If you are not talking and there's any background noise in your area, or if you're going to be on the computer or anything else, then be sure you mute your microphone because it'll jump forward and kind of throw your picture on the front if it hears any noise from your area. So that gets to be a little distracting. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump right into it. I'm Eric Bowles again. I'm a full-time professional nature photographer. I'm director of Nikonians Academy for North America. I do workshops and private instruction. I specialize in nature photography in the southeastern U.S. Kind of my main places that I photograph are here in the Atlanta area. I live in Morningside. So my birding location in the area is both my neighborhood and then also Zonalite Park is really close to my house. I've spent a lot of time in the Okefenokee and also a lot of time at Jekyll Island, among other places. I'm past president of Georgia Nature Photographers Association, which is an organization that is specifically about nature photography, and there are 8 chapters around the state, gnpa.org, if you're interested. And I have been through the Master Birder certification through Burge, Georgia, and been doing this class for a while. So my contact information's on there. If you have questions for me, or if there's anything I can help with, email is probably the best way to reach me because sometimes my schedule gets kind of crazy, but feel free to reach out. Feel free to contact me if I can help. Tonight, what we're going to do is just kind of cover an overview of bird photography and birding and different types of photography. We'll talk a little bit about gear, but we're going to talk about it from the perspective of somebody who is a bit more advanced in the photography. They're at least intermediate level. And so we're going to be talking about intermediate and advanced levels of gear. We'll be talking about exposure, the exposure triangle, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, those things. We'll spend a good bit of time about focus and also talk about why you might not have sharp images or might have out of focus images and what some of the causes are. And by the way, just so you know, it's less likely to be the equipment than anything else. And then we're going to close with more discussion about technique. We're going to get together on Saturday for a bird walk over at Blue Heron Nature Center. Just park in the parking lot there, and we're going to go back upstream along the creek, along the boardwalk there. And normally there's some really good birding activity this time of year. It works out well, and you'll have a chance to put into practice what we talk about tonight, and also ask questions. There's always some good questions and good discussion that goes on. And by the way, we'll see some good birds too. So with that, I've introduced myself. I'm going to turn it over to you. Does somebody have a question? I'm going to turn it over to you. And what I'd like to do is get each of you to jump in with your name, your photography experience, specifically around birding and bird photography. And if there's something in particular that you'd like to learn today or like to talk about, if you mention that as well. So who'd like to go first? Okay, Lizzie?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
I can, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, good. Because I can't see me, so I don't know if I'm on. Anyway, I'm Lacey Stallman. I've been birding for about 10 years, but not consistently. I just got back from a wonderful trip to Dauphin Island for 5 days, and it was splendid. I'm learning. It was my first attempt to learn to use my new Canon mirrorless RS7 with the big lens. It's a lot lighter. I'm 4'7", so it's two pounds lighter is much better for me.
That makes a big difference. That's
yeah,
great.
it does make a big difference, and I'm doing better, and I'm watching a lot of YouTubes on settings, which is great. Halfway through, I picked up some stuff that really helped. My main thing is birds, capturing birds in flight. I'm still having trouble just getting on them. So if you've got anything, any ideas for that, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I can promise you that it's practice, practice, practice.
Yeah.
The more you photograph, the better you get. I know if I'm down at Jekyll Island for a week, my first day out is pretty ratty in terms of my success on birds in flight. The second day is pretty good, and by the end of the week, it's just old hat. I mean, head rate goes way up after you get a couple of thousand shots under your belt. So I would just encourage you to shoot a lot. Second thing is to try to use a focus area, and we'll talk about this more, but set the focus area that your camera is using for something that's not the entire frame. Kind of reduce the size a little bit, because you're really going to want to photograph the bird in the middle of the frame. And then the third thing, and this especially applies to shorebirds, is in an ideal situation, you'll have the wind and the light coming from the same direction. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but what that means is the birds tend to rest on the beach going into the wind. They tend to land into the wind, and they tend to take off into the wind, which means if the wind is from your back and the light is from your back, it means that every bird is going to be facing you on the beach. They're going to land coming toward you, and they're going to take off coming toward you, and the wind's going to slow them down, and they're going to be real slow and kind of hang in the air. So it just becomes super, super easy when you've got that situation. And by the way, every single one of those is in perfect light. So that's the tip of the day for shorebirds in particular, and especially birds in flight. If the birds are flying downwind, so if it's the opposite direction, then your choice is birds that are all backlit and in shadow, so lots of silhouettes. And then the other thing is the birds are going so fast when they're coming from behind you in nice light that you've got nothing but bird butts, and they're going really fast. So you have to kind of pick and choose your opportunities there. And if the wind and the light don't cooperate, then sometimes you choose to photograph somewhere else. Maybe it's inland or some other subject matter.
Thank
Okay,
you.
next. How about Ember?
Oh, am I on? Can you hear me?
Yep, got it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Ember. I am a professional photographer by trade. I have a degree in digital photography, but I also shoot a lot of film and analog stuff, because I'm love being broke apparently. I've been
And
photographing in a professional capacity since 2017. And one thing I would like to learn today, in addition to just like getting sharper images of birds, my experiences in weddings and live music, so a lot different than birds. Getting sharper images, and then how to creatively compose pictures of birds out in the wild. I have a 70 to 200 is my longest lens, so I don't have one of the real big ones like a lot of people who do wildlife photography. So definitely want to learn how to make the most of that focal length.
sure, that makes perfect sense. So starting with that lens, I've got that same focal length and I use it a lot. It's tough for bird photography because it's not a lot of magnification. And the one thing I would say is count on shooting where you have an environmental context. So that may mean that you get closer or you look for feeders or places where they're feeding. It may be you concentrate a little more on wading birds, but really pay attention to the context and the environment they're in when you're trying to get those shots.
Mhm.
Because that's ideal with that lens. Wading
Gotcha.
birds and larger birds can be a little easier. For birds in flight, we'll talk more about birds in flight today, and then we'll also talk about it on Saturday. So um, birds in flight can be really hard, but it's really more a matter of practice than anything else. One
Mhm.
thing I would say is that your photographic experience, especially with low light and with weddings, means you're used to photographing lots of people and you're used to photographing lots of details. And
Mhm.
so I would apply that to your wildlife portraits as well. And
Mhm.
think about the photos that are hard or creative or unusual that you photograph for a wedding or something like that. And then think about how that might translate into a bird photograph. So maybe it's a backlit subject, maybe it's the light in an unusual place, maybe it's an unusual perspective or something like that. But those are
Mhm.
those same ideas, and also the use of flash. Those same ideas apply to birds.
Gotcha. Sounds good.
Okay. Next, how about you, Hannah?
Hi. So my name is Hannah. So yeah, I am joining this class today because I have never actually taken a birding photography class, so I would really like to learn more about it and stuff. Pretty much my photography experience is more along the lines of I do social media marketing, so I have a lot of experience shooting like hotels and resorts and doing architecture and like some lifestyle candid type photos, but in my free time, I really love nature. I really love wildlife. So I've started, yeah, taking my camera out when I go hiking and that kind of thing. But birds, oh, birds are always like one of the hardest things to shoot on these hikes. So I was definitely looking forward to some tips here. I usually when I do nature photography, it's typically more like macro photography that I've had a lot more practice with. I like taking photos like spiders and bugs and that kind of thing. But yeah, so I'm kind of in the same boat as I think Ember was your name. I have a 50 to 200 millimeter lens as well, so I'm just kind of looking to like make the most of that and use that when I can because I don't have a ton of experience trying to do bird photography. But yeah, looking forward to it. So thanks
Yeah,
for having this class.
I don't see any problem at all with using the lens you have. I mean, that's where you start. And the thing is that you'll never talk with a photographer who said, "Oh, I've got a long enough lens. I just don't need anything longer." Everyone always wants something longer because they always want to photograph a bird that's farther and farther away. And then they realize that what they really need to be doing is getting closer to the bird, not photographing it with a longer and longer lens. And so there's kind of a blend in between there. What you'll find is that the actual magnification of the bird, if you can find birds that your feeder or at a water feature or a bird bath or something like that, you can do pretty well, even with the focal length that you have. And then also, as I mentioned to Ember, concentrate on getting those environmental shots where you've got the context of where they live, the environment they're in, and unusual lighting and other things that might make it creative.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Okay, next, how about Jack?
Hi, I'm Jack. I've been doing bird photography for about a year and a half now, and I have a 150 to 600 millimeter lens.
That's a good lens, plenty of focal length. That's
And I'd like to focus more on get better with birds in flight.
okay. That can be a challenge. Now, do you have the Tamron or Sigma 150 to
Tamron.
Okay. That's a good lens. And the one thing that what camera system do you use?
D500.
Okay. So one thing that you kind of have to keep in mind with that system is that lens goes to f6.3 at the long end. And your camera is a very good camera, but it's not going to focus with all the focus points when you're at f6.3. It's only going to focus on the ones that are kind of clustered around the center and in that middle of the frame. So what you need to do is make sure your focus point is staying toward that middle area, the middle sensor and the adjoining ones. And that's going to give you the best chance of focusing when that lens is fully zoomed. So just something that's a little different. With mirrorless, people don't have to worry about that. It'll focus with the same, as long as there's enough light and contrast, it'll focus. But in your case, when you're at that 600 millimeters, the end of that zoom lens, it is a point where not every sensor on that camera will work and not the entire frame will work for focus. So hopefully we can help and also have a lot of opportunity with examples and things to try when we're out in the field. So, how about Kathleen?
Hi, it's Kathy. I go by Kathy.
Kathy, thank you.
So, I mean, I've been doing photography, mostly nature, flowers, macro, and all for a few years now. And I've recently been spending a bunch of time photographing the birds at my feeder in my backyard. And I'm better at when they are eating at the feeder than when they're coming in or out from the feeder. And I'd love to get better at getting those shots. When they're in the trees nearby, I find that I have a very difficult time finding them. You know, I can see them with my eyes. I put the camera up to my face and like I don't know where they are. I have no
Right.
idea. So I would love to get some tips on how do you find them once the camera's in front of your face.
Yeah, understand that one completely. Tell me, what camera do you use?
I have an Olympus mirrorless.
Okay. That's a good system, compact size, and there's some very good lenses for it. So your gear is perfectly capable.
Yep.
So one tip for being able to kind of locate or follow birds that are in a tree or in an area when you put your eye up to the lens is try learning to photograph with both eyes open.
Okay.
One of your eyes you'll have through the viewfinder and you'll be using that. The other eye will not be through the viewfinder, and you're just going to be looking normally at the birds, but it's going to help you point the right direction. And it takes some practice to kind of get used to it. But this idea of one eye through the viewfinder, one eye that's not through the viewfinder will help you line up on a subject a little easier.
Okay.
The other thing is to look on the trees or grass or whatever the environment is, look for things that help with alignment or markers. So what I use a lot of times is a tree or a big branch or the first fork up on a tree or something like that, something that I can find. And that's really helpful in being able to to transfer from where I know there's a bird there, I know it's about this place on the tree, and then get it in the lens and be able to see and view it through the lens. There's one other thing that might be useful, and it depends on the camera, and I'm not sure whether you can do this with your camera. But on my camera and on all my Nikon cameras, and as well as I know on most of the Sony cameras and Canon cameras, you're able to program a button on your camera so it zooms. And what it does is it enlarges the view, and you can do that. Normally you do it on playback to be able to see, oh, was this photo in focus? But you can also set it up to do that before you take the photo. So the bird you're viewing, you can actually magnify it. It's almost like electronic binoculars. You can magnify what you're seeing. And so if you can do that, or if you can set your camera up that way, that's helpful, because what I found is since I've started using a mirrorless camera, I've stopped carrying binoculars when I'm on a birding outing or leading a birding walk. And I've been doing that for 7 or 8 years now, that I just simply stop carrying the binoculars. I only view things through the lens. And then I use this button to zoom in. It was something I picked up on a Sony forum early on, before my camera even arrived.
So are you starting with it wider or
I'm
starting
starting with the wider, and then when I can find the bird
Okay.
and see it, then I press another button and it zooms in more, and I can see it and watch it closely. So for example, I've photographed a bald eagle in the top of a tree that was, probably a half mile away. And I was looking through the viewfinder and watching for it to turn its head so it was turned toward the camera and not away from the camera.
Yep.
Or I'm watching a bird and it's darting in and out behind a little branch or a little leaf, and able to see it very clearly as to when it pokes its head out to be able to make the shot.
So you're looking at it more magnified than what the picture is going to be.
Yes, that's
Gotcha.
exactly right. That's
Okay.
exactly right.
I
But I
don't know
can
if I can do that or
typically,
not, but I can check.
yeah, typically on a bird walk, we'll pick up 2 or 3 species just from using that kind of a function and being able to also get a photo of the bird when you're looking at it. So there are some electronic binoculars that are out today that will take a photo, but this is a way to do something very close with your camera, as well as be able to get a higher quality photo.
Okay.
Okay, how about Steve?
Hi, Eric. This is Steve Rushing. Hey, this is Steve Rushing. If I divulge how long I've been photographing, I'd have to divulge my age.
Uh-oh, don't do that.
It's been a long time. And I'm here tonight, as I usually am in forums like this, just to listen. And I've never come away without picking up tips that make my photography better. And one of the things, interestingly, is I'm really interested in the conversation that's been going on a little bit earlier, and I'm sure we'll delve into it, is forcing myself to put down the reach that I'm addicted to and start trying to take some more of the environmental storytelling types of photographs of the bird, which I sense is becoming a theme that people are getting more into being storytellers rather than just portrait people. And so learning how to do the shorter lens. And I know this is not tonight, but I'll work on it another, is to blend that with more videography, video work.
Yes,
to tell a
definitely.
more story. So
Yeah, that's a great point. It is a matter of kind of telling a story both about the subject, the place, the context, kind of what you're doing. And there are a lot of different stories that you can tell. So you'll see a group of 4 photos later in the program talking about conservation. And it's photos from a banding station kind of up in Cape May, New Jersey, where they were banding the red nuts. And it's just part of a series of photos that I made when I had an hour or so with access to that banding station to be able to photograph the banding activities as well as the birds themselves. And so it really makes a much more complete story about what's going on and what's taking place to protect that particular bird. In other cases, I might be someplace like the Okefenokee, and so you want to be able to capture not only photos of the bird itself in the close-up, but all those close-ups tend to look alike. And so you can pull back a little bit and have the context. Well, gee, this is not just a barred owl face. This is a barred owl perched in a tree that's just covered with Spanish moss. And it's early in the morning. And this is an early morning view after it rained last night. So the bird and the moss are all soaked with water. You've got the Spanish moss, and it's kind of telling the story of a unique location.
No, I totally agree. And I like your comment to one of the earlier people who was talking about their wedding experience. That's
Yes.
something I wish I had more of, actually, to be able, and also to see the details like the ring. There's some photograph about a bird doing certain behavior that would be equivalent to the ring shot.
Well,
And
that's right. And there's even some techniques you might use. So we get all hung up on subject autofocus, where the camera is smart enough to be able to find the subject, and it's looking for a bird and it finds the bird's eye, and that's really nice. But one of the things you might run into is the bird's hiding behind a branch. And you want to pre-focus on the bird, so you're going to focus on the branch, or you're going to focus on the shoulder or leg of the bird, trying to kind of get close before it's time to take that photo of the bird.
Right.
Well, I want to be able to turn off subject identification for that purpose, because I need the camera to be willing to focus very quickly on a branch, and then I can get the shot later. If it's not willing to focus on a branch and keeps jumping to the bird, or keeps looking for a bird when my subject is behind a branch, it's going to find all kinds of leaves and sticks and tree trunks and things like that, which clearly that works against me.
right. And you missed opportunity to do some interesting framing.
Yes.
With the foreground too. And I also shoot Olympus or OM system.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that I have set up as a lever where I can flick off bird detection real quickly and go to single focus point.
Yeah, it's not that bird detection is bad. It's just that it's not going to work 100% of the time, and you need to have a strategy for, okay, when I need plan B, what do I do and how do I get there? And so what you described there is perfect. Being able to switch it off or quickly move to a different mode, be able to get the shot that you need, and then you move back to the normal approach for the rest of the time. So that's good. Okay, who else? Who haven't we has not introduced themselves yet? Tony?
Hey,
who's that? Jack, go ahead.
the other Jack. I thought maybe I got called earlier, but there's two Jacks.
Okay.
Yeah, so my name's Jack Curran. My photography experience is, I guess right after college, I worked at a photography studio doing like school portraits for a little bit. I also did like what I would call like bar promotional photography through college and grad school to make some extra money. But that was a long time ago. So since then, really, I'm just more of like a, hobbyist. I've done some sports stuff. I've been birding for about a little bit less than a year. And that's where I'm like, okay, now I can, get back out there and actually find some stuff to take pictures of. And that's been awesome. I've currently got a Canon R7 in the RF 200 to 800, which my friends lovingly call the Birdzuka, because it is, it's kind of a massive thing to control. I'm definitely interested in the autofocus conversation, because I have a lot of trouble with that. But I guess for another thing, maybe some tips on, since it is warbler season right now, I'd say one issue that I have a lot is, you're looking straight up and maybe it's a little cloudy and, everything is kind of like backlit with this gray, and everything under and where the bird is very dark. And so you kind of have two options, which is either make everything really dark or, you know, really overcompensate with the exposure, and then everything's like washed out and doesn't look very good. So like if there's any tips there, I think that would be something that I would love to be better at.
Sure, and I'll just give you a couple of quick tips on that, because the gray sky is something that certainly resonates. I do a lot of photography using manual exposure, and I really do it for a couple of reasons and take a couple of different approaches. One is that a bird that is in bright sunlight, full sunlight, is going to be the same exposure every time, all day long. If the light's not changing, your exposure doesn't change. And it doesn't matter whether what the background is, what the context is. A sunlit subject is going to be the same exposure every single time. There's even a rule on this that goes way, way back. It's called Sunny 16. And basically it says that at f16, your shutter speed is equal to your ISO. Now, obviously for birds, we're not going to shoot at f16, but what it says is once you have that exposure, it's always going to be the same. So one approach is manual exposure. For the bird that's in shadow, or the bird that is up on a branch or in the sky, what you're seeing is not the sunny side of that bird usually. You're probably seeing the shady side of that bird. So you're going to have to change, and you're going to have to use some other exposure. And there are different ways to get there. One is to go ahead and set up an event for manual exposure and say, listen, this is the hard shot that I'm going to have today. Let me just go ahead and pick that kind of a subject and pick a branch or a tree limb or something like that that's in full shade. And let me go ahead and set that exposure up manually so I know I can get to that point and it's really close. And so I'll use the camera's automation for everything else. And then if it ever needs to be, if I ever get into that dark subject against the gray sky, all I do is flip it to manual and it's already set up and it's already correct or pretty close. The other way to approach that subject is the opposite way around. It's to use exposure compensation. And so then you're using an automated approach, such as aperture priority or auto ISO with manual. And you can use a little plus or minus on your camera and either add light or subtract light. So if it's too dark, you need to add light. That's going to slow the shutter speed or increase the ISO. But it's going to start getting you closer to that subject, and you can do it pretty quickly. So you basically, out of those options, you have to work out a plan. What's my plan going to be? And then there's one final option that you might consider, and that's one that I use especially, for example, with shorebirds. And it's that I pick photos that I can be successful on. So if the light is a certain type of light, I'll photograph the subject. And if it's the wrong light, even if it's kind of last minute or something quick, I learned to be able to skip those photos that I can't get a good exposure on quickly enough. And so you're not constantly chasing something that you're too late for. You just know that I've got this window or this angle where the light is working in my favor. I'm going to concentrate on those photos, not try to shoot 360 degrees around me and trying to pick up things where I've got really low probability of success. So we'll run into that kind of thing a lot on Saturday, and we'll talk about it more, but those are kind of the ideas that run through my mind when I'm getting into that situation.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Tony?
I am Tony Weir, and I have been birding since probably 2020, and I have just been taking photographs of birds for the last year. I have no experience with photography. I just bought a camera and started watching YouTube videos and started posting pictures every day. And so now my strategy is just to practice, 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 and surround myself with people who know what they're doing and try to learn as much as I can. So I think right now, I'm also looking at some exposure issues, particularly when I take pictures of white birds. They're always overexposed, no matter what I do, it seems. So that has been a challenge for me lately. And I'm also having some challenges with noise in my photos.
Okay. So what what exposure mode are you using? Are you shooting auto or program or manual or aperture?
I
What are
am
you-
shooting manual and
Okay.
I'm trying to control it all on the fly.
Okay, so my number one suggestion for getting your exposure right is to slow down a little bit and then also anticipate some of the problems. So you mentioned an example with white birds.
Yes.
If you're using the little indicator in the screen that says, okay, my exposures needs to be centered or needs to be somewhere around this little middle thing here, you're going to find that that's almost always going to overexpose a white bird, especially a white bird that's small in the frame. And so what you'll end up doing is kind of deciding, okay, where do I apply the experience and art to this? Kind of how do I assume I know the camera is going to tell me the wrong thing, so what do I need to do to adjust it, get it the right direction? So I can increase the shutter speed, I can decrease the ISO. There are things I can do, but what I want to do is I want to make sure I don't really blow out and mess up the photo with that white bird. When it comes to noise, it may be that same thing that causes you to want to get the exposure right is guiding you toward using a higher ISO than you necessarily need to. So if the subject is perched or if they're standing, you can probably get away with a little slower shutter speed and a slower ISO. Make sure your aperture is the lowest number you can set your camera for. Because when you need light, rather than increasing your ISO up to whatever it is and running into noise, first thing you do is let's start with an aperture that works. So that's why I was asking you if you were using aperture priority, because that's one of the semi-automated modes that kind of lets you pick the aperture. And normally for wildlife, it's going to be whatever the lowest is. You don't need to shoot wildlife at f11 very often. They're very specific shots where you need f10 or f11 or something like that. What you really are trying to do is shoot it at the lowest aperture your camera has to get in as much light as possible. So we'll have a chance to practice some of those things on Saturday. We'll definitely have lots of opportunities to work on exposure, getting the right exposure, and also setting it up right in the field. And we'll also talk about it tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, who else? Anybody else? Anybody who has not
Yeah.
introduced them? Yeah.
Hey, this is Mike.
Oh,
State.
good, Mike. Thanks.
Yeah, I was there last month when you had the basic course.
Good.
My history with birding is my wife and I do it together, and we started several years ago after I listened to a book, you may have heard of it, To See Every Bird on Earth. And it's about a story about a guy whose father was a birder and he kept a list of all the birds he saw, and his goal was to see as many as he could. And I thought, well, that'd be kind of a fun thing for me and my wife to do. So we started keeping a list, and no bird goes on the list unless we both see it. So as a result, we've traveled quite a bit in the country and some other countries. And some of the trips we've been on have had guides, birding guides, and they're usually local people and they can point out different birds, and you don't have to identify them because the local guide tells you what they are.
Yeah.
But on some of the trips we go on, we don't have a guide. And I try to study the birds before I go, so I know what I'm, expected to see. But I'm kind of on my own with that. So when I take a picture or if I see a bird, I want to be sure I can identify it. And sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't. Sometimes the shots are a little blurry. And I think a lot of it, the problem I have is I don't use my camera often enough. My son's a real estate photographer and he uses his camera every day. So he's very familiar with it, but I pick up my camera maybe, I don't know, once every 2 months to go out birding. And the solution, I think, is just to spend more time birding.
Yeah, you'll get really a lot better just by using it. You don't have to make perfect photos. You just have to make lots of photos.
Yeah.
And then you'll get more and more proficient, and you'll be able to get better and better in terms of being able to use the camera and getting photos.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us started the same place you are, where you started and the reason you're taking photos is because you need help identifying the birds. If I get a good photo of it, then I can go back and look it up and be able to identify it.
Right.
And certainly apps like the Merlin app are really helpful with identification. Sometimes too good, so it doesn't work you quite hard enough. We will talk tonight about using photos for identification and the types of photos that you need to get to be able to help with identification. Because there's certain types that you might want for identification that you might throw away when it comes to art. And so it's a matter of what kind of photos you're trying to make.
Yeah, if it's artistic, that's icing on the cake. That's nice. But I'm mainly using it for identification. And I've taken pictures of shorebirds and gone back and looked through them and realized, oh, that's such and such that I've never seen before. And I didn't recognize it at the time, so I was glad I had a photo of it.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that specifically in just a little bit, because I've run into those kinds of situations as well. And it's not at all unusual to be out, even with experienced birders, to be out there, and it's the photo that makes the difference in being able to identify a particular subject.
Yeah.
Okay, anyone else? Okay. Well, we heard a lot about kind of why people make photographs, but let's just talk about it a little bit further. One obviously is fine art, and fine art is kind of what I would describe as taking a photo where the primary objective is to make a pretty photo of a bird. It doesn't necessarily have to be a rarity, but it's artistically the best photo you can make of that particular bird. So I'm thinking about things like head position. I'm thinking about what's the bird doing and what makes this particular photo attractive. Another reason might be identification, or to document the fact that you saw a particular subject. And so these are the kinds of things that come up when you're birding. And what being able to get that documentation, being able to submit it with eBird when you're documenting what bird you saw at a particular time, and even to help with your own identification using Merlin or some similar tool. The social media, I heard several of you mention tonight that was one of your main interests, is sharing with others in social media. And there are several things going on there. One is, it's good for birding if you're sharing photos of birds, because it helps to build a following of people that are more interested in birds. Just like using a feeder to feed and take care of the birds. Anything you can do that helps create interest in birds is really good for birds in general. Another piece of that is on social media, being able to share your successes or share your challenges, because everyone's going to run into challenges where you're trying to make a photo and it's not quite what you want. I do suggest that you use a bit of caution when you're going to Facebook in particular, but social media for solutions to a problem, because in most cases, the people who are responding on Facebook or something like that aren't the people who really have a lot of experience, or aren't necessarily people with a lot of experience. They may have taken a lot of photos, they may have posted a lot of photos that they've shared, but they may not know the technical answers as to your camera, and what you're doing, whether it's right or wrong. So I would say take social media advice with a grain of salt. Another one is editorial or journalism. Good example of that is photos that come out of a particular photo outing that are used for, maybe it's an article. Birds Georgia is always looking for photos to be able to tell what members have been doing, what's taking place on various birding outings, and even to be able to document bird rarities or uncommon birds that were seen on a particular walk. But just as important is documenting the people that were on that trip and the fact they were having a good time together at a Birds Georgia event. So all those are different ways that editorial or journalism photography can fall into the mix. We talked earlier about conservation in the environment, and there are a lot of ways that works. One is to document banding or other activities. Another is to be able to take those photographs that show the context for the environment a particular subject is in. And with that, as long as you can get close enough to the bird to be able to have it be material in the photograph, you can have a bird that's relatively small in the frame, but it still makes a compelling photo. And so we'll be talking about that a little bit. For all of us, there's always this constant balance of kind of wanting to be able to take good photos, but also wanting to develop skills and challenge ourselves to make better photos. Amber, with your experience with weddings and events, I think one of the opportunities for you is going to be things like taking the photo that is really hard, taking the one that requires flash, taking the photo of the subject that's backlit or something that's a bit unique. Shooting high key, but shooting it in the camera rather than in post-processing, things like that. So there are a lot of things you can do with photos that are using what you know through other places, but you're challenging yourself to learn a new way to photograph or apply what you know to a different type of genre. And then finally, things like just simply being out and enjoying nature. That's part of why many people bird is to have the activity out there, to be outside, and enjoying nature is certainly part of it. So I've got some suggestions here in terms of fine art and things to think about, but the big thing is you're creating the photo and you're wanting to produce a photo that has the greatest artistic value. These are not photos that all look the same. You're wanting one that it really kind of makes your jaw drop when you see this particular photo or see this subject conveyed. It might or might not be a rarity. In some cases, it's a rarity, but in most cases, a fine art photo is a rather ordinary subject that's photographed in an extraordinary manner. And so that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about photographing or judging photos that are taken for the purpose of fine art. I curate a gallery at Chattahoochee Nature Center for Georgia Nature Photography Association. They always have a series of contests, but what I'm looking for there is I'm looking for mainly fine art photography. And there's usually a theme or something that goes into it, but I'm looking to make sure that above all, this is a group of photos that stands up as a gallery and comes together and really stands out with photos that are outstanding because of the way they artistically captured the subject matter. So it can be a single print, it can be a group of prints. The priority is artistic presentation. And what that does is many times, because it's going to be printed and framed or mounted and displayed, it's going to limit your ability to crop. And you're going to want to be able to photograph something without that extra need to have to crop and get closer. So it kind of puts a little bit more pressure on you in terms of making a good photo. Techniques, big things are things that it does require exceptional technical execution. One tip for that would be you want the head of the bird to be pointed slightly toward the camera, never away. I have a comment that I kind of give to photo people in workshops. I don't want to photograph bird butts. I don't want to photograph the bird after it's already passed and is going away. I'm wanting the bird coming toward me, not going away from me after I've missed it. Ideally, I'd want to show a key moment, something that's behavioral or flight. I want exceptional good lighting, and I may take hours or days for a single good photo. What I'm looking is for that one exceptional photo, not just simply to document what I see. So as an example, here's one, great egret. It's a fairly common subject. In this case, it's in breeding plumage, so the time of year is important. The lighting it's well lit and the light's balanced. Actually have a little catch light in the eye, and the catch light is actually because I used a flash on this, just a real gentle fill flash. The black background behind it came because it had a shadow behind it, and I was using the shadow as part of the composition. And what made this photo is the bird was cocking its head back, and so the head's perfectly aligned with those feathers. in addition, of course, to the bright colors. So you've got a white bird, no color there, but you do have those green lures, the red eye, and the orange bill, and that's what makes the photo. Here's another example of a fine art photo. This is just the silhouette. I say just silhouette, but it's a silhouette that you can see all the aspects of the bird. You can see that it's below the horizon. You can tell there's water in the background. It's exposed to be able to take advantage of and show some context of the background, but the bird is shown as just the silhouette. I think it's a laughing gull. I don't recall exactly what I was photographing at the time, but it's probably a laughing gull. And just interesting because this is the way it came out of the camera. There's very little done to it. Now we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about birding photography. And many of us spend time birding and wanting to get photographs along the way. You may be taking the photos because of conservation or environmental reasons. You may be looking to document the subject matter you're seeing, especially rarities, because as you know, with the eBird, if you turn in something that's a rarity, they're going to want some documentation on it if it really is rare. It may be to help with identification, and certainly most of us got started that way. And also you want something to share on social media. The skill, the challenge, and enjoying nature is all part of it. So here's a group of photos. These are from Cape May. Kind of documents some of the things you see when you were involved in bird banding. The logging, the details on the bird, the measurements, the band number, the weight, the wing measurements. You can see them measuring the wing on the top right. You can see the bird being weighed in the bottom left. You can see the bird bands as well as the tool that's used to band the birds in the bottom right. And so this is just an example of what takes place at a banding station when people are banding birds. And in this case, this is up at Cape May. Another thing we talked about just a few minutes ago was taking a photo for the purpose of identification. And this is different because what you're trying to do here is you're trying to make sure that you capture the key views of a bird that are going to give you the ability to identify it. And that means multiple angles. Remember when I said no bird butts? If you're photographing for identification, then often a bird's butt is going to be a great angle. The same with photographing it from underneath or from photographing the underside of a wing or a shoulder. Even if it's a little out of focus, those field marks are important. So the tail, the throat, the collar, the breast, the underside of the wing, all of these things make a difference in terms of capturing field marks that can be used to identify that bird. Maybe you can't even, maybe it's out of focus, but it still works for the purpose of identification. If you can tag it with GPS coordinates, as you can with some cameras, that's helpful because it documents where they are. The photo you're going to see in a minute is of a bird that was taken on a pelagic trip off the South Carolina coast. And there was a question as to which county this bird was photographed in because it was going to be a record for that particular county for the earliest sighting of that particular bird. And GPS was the only way to coordinate it and to decide what county that bird was found in. Digital zoom is a crop, and cropping is fine, it's useful, but just understand that it is cropping and it's not actually magnifying the subject, it's just reducing the size of the image. So when I'm trying to photograph for identification, one of the things I think that's running through my mind is the first thing I want is a safety shot. The first chance I have to be able to make a photo of a bird, that's the one I'm going to take. And then as I can get closer and get more photos before the bird takes off, I'll continue to work and get a handful of photos of that subject. That first shot, the bird can be very small in the frame, but I'm continuing to work the subject and get larger, and it will get larger in the frame as I'm able to get closer. So here's an example. This is from a pelagic trip. This is the photo, it's a black-capped petrel as it turned out. But the key here was we had a bird that flew by. It was about probably 150 yards away. It made one pass and that was it. It was gone. We were on the water for 7 days, and this is the only black-capped petrel that we saw over a 7-day period. And so the question is, how can you identify this bird? And can you be sure that it's this bird as opposed to something else? And we were experienced birders, but you still can't pick it up if you're not able to document and have a little more time. So in this case, here, look at the field marks. It had the face of the bird, it had the shoulder, it had the belly of the bird, it had the underside of the wing, and just as important as the underside and the shoulder was the composition of those lines around the borders of the wing on the underside. That was also helpful in identifying that this was in fact a black-capped petrel. It was a key mark. So all these things kind of added together were part of identification. And then now 10 years later with the same photo and the current technology, you throw this into Merlin, and sure enough, Merlin identifies it immediately as a black-capped petrel, and no problem at all. But at the time, we probably spent 30 minutes debating as to, was this a black-capped petrel or some other bird that was more common in the area? So here's another example. We talk about close-ups of birds. What I have found in doing a little research is that all these big expensive lenses that people use to photograph birds, they all end up with just about the same level of magnification. So they're great for further away subjects, but in terms of closest subjects, they've got a minimum focus distance you can use to focus with that particular lens. And with that minimum focus distance comes the magnification. And they all seem to be around the same magnification, about 1 to 6 or 1 to 5.5, 1 to 6.5, somewhere in that range. So it's not super highly magnified, but you can zoom in and you can get pretty close. Now, when you've got a bird, in this case, it was a bird at a feeder, and I was trying to test some lenses. And so I didn't mind the fact that it's got suet on its beak. That would ruin it from a standpoint of fine art. And I probably wouldn't put this on social media. But the thing that stood out to me on this, by getting this level of detail, was I could see the little feathers that made up the eye ring of the bluebird. And so it was kind of a surprise to me that you had these little tiny feathers there that are making up the eye ring. And you've got, I don't know, 20 of them, 20 individual feathers making up the width of the eye on the bluebird. And what I did find and learn also out of this is with this kind of magnification, it makes a difference what part of the eye you're focusing on, the near part, the middle part, or the far part, because the depth of field is so shallow with this level of magnification for a bird. So what I am looking for in photographing small birds like this is I want them to be facing slightly to the side like this, so everything looks like it's in focus, and it's a little bit more forgiving. Here's another view of a female bluebird. Again, slightly out of focus at this level of magnification, but it's probably 200% magnification or higher. And you can see those little feathers that are around the eye, just lots and lots of detail when you get this close, the individual fibers that make up a feather. So we're going to do a little game here. I've got a series of typical photos, starting with the safety shot and kind of working to get closer on a bird. The purpose is identification. And if you've seen this one from the basics class a couple weeks ago, please hold off. But let's go ahead and take a look. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and answer when you can identify the bird. So look at the bird, look at the way you see it. This is not unlike what you'd actually run into, and this is the series of photos to identify a bird like this. So this is what I'm seeing, a bird in a bush. You can see it hopping around. You can barely make it out. It's right there in the center. So let me give you some magnification. That's what it looks like. And when something is blocked by bushes and leaves like this, often you're going to find that you have to manually tweak focus to get it to focus on the bird. And so that's okay. You can do that. With many lenses and cameras, you can just simply adjust the focus ring and just adjust it manually just a little bit and be able to make the photo. And you can override the autofocus. And that's what's needed to be able to get this sharp enough. So any takers on trying to guess the bird? We'll go to the next photo. Here's another view. Okay, now the bird's kind of moved away. I've been able to move to the side a little bit. The bird's jumped to another branch. It's still facing the same direction, but you can see the color of the legs. You can see a little bit more color up around the head. And you can see a little bit of the breast. See a little bit of maybe yellowish olive on the trailing wing feathers there. Still not a lot. So now we're able to see a little bit more of the bird. This is slightly out of focus. All it's done is turned its head just to the right. You've got a glimpse. So press the shutter and get the shot. Now you can have a pretty good shot at identifying, but we'll go ahead and keep going. And now we can see where that white was coming from. It was just above the eye band, that mask. We've got a little bit of white on the upper side of it. And this bird's singing, so probably can pick up the call at this time. So it's a bird that actively is singing. Black mask, yellow throat. And a little bit better view, continuing to work the subject. Can see the throat. Any guesses?
Common yellowthroat.
Common yellowthroat, that's it. Okay, and here it is. Finally, it cooperated a little bit more and pulled out into something that that I could see a little bit more easily. But this is what you run into. You run into these situations where you have a bird that's hiding. You can see bits and pieces of it, and you capture 4 or 5 photos, and now all of a sudden you've got enough that you can probably get pretty close on identification, and you don't have to have this last shot to be able to get there. Now, surprisingly enough, eBird's pretty good on I don't know how far I would have to go with eBird to get an ID on this, but it would probably be pretty good on it. Sometimes it's amazing. But this is the kind of thing that we're going to run into. None of these are fine art photos. These are all identification photos, but identification photos that can be useful. So let's talk a little bit about camera settings. So first is the metering area. And the reason I'm covering this is not just for your exposure, but so you understand kind of how metering works. The terminology that's used on different cameras is similar, but it's not exactly the same. So it'll be some version of this. But the smallest area you would have is spot metering. That's kind of like the area you would want to focus on. And what the camera is doing at that point is simply just deciding on how much light is there based on where that particular spot is located. So let's go back to this photo. If you happen to put that spot right on the bird's eye or on its cheek here, right below the eye, it's going to say, oh, this is black, and I've got to set the exposure based on it being black. If, on the other hand, you put it on the shoulder of the bird, then it's going to say, oh, well, this is tan, kind of yellowish tan. That's a pretty even exposure. I can meter on that. That's about the same as neutral gray, and it'll be fine. But where you happen to put that box, that focus box, makes a difference. But that is the spot you're metering. For the purpose of bird photography, it's not going to be very useful most of the time. But every now and then you might find it's useful to judge your exposure. So for example, we were talking earlier about white birds. And let's make it easy. Let's make it a gray to gret. if I want to set an exposure correctly for a gray to red, one way I can do that is to spot meter the white on that bird and then meter and adjust from that level, because I know that that the camera's going to try to make that kind of a neutral gray, and that's going to be wrong, but I can actually get close. Ember, you photograph weddings. For you, a white bird is the same way you photograph a wedding dress. There are different ways to be able to meter it, but one is to meter off the bride's skin, another is to meter off the dress and make an adjustment, or you can meter off the scene, and so all of those are valid options. So second one we've got is center weighted, and that's one where we're going to be metering the whole frame. So regardless of where you put the sensor, it's going to put a little more weight on that, but it's going to also meter the whole frame with more weight on the center or wherever the subject is located in that image. The third is either the entire frame or matrix, or there's some other names for it. That considers the whole frame, and the camera tries to guess what kind of a scene this is. Based on exposure on the composition, they're probably going to assume that it's a portrait, and so they're going to put more priority on subject for portraits. But if you were back a little bit further and it was a beach, they're going to try to figure out, oh, I see sky, I see sand, that's a beach, I'll expose based on that. And they'll apply scene recognition technology to help assess what this frame is working like. They might also choose something called, on some cameras, highlight weighted, and that meters totally based on the highlights, the brightest area of the frame. Or the final is based on the subject. So wherever the focus point is located, it's going to meter based on the subject. Now, what this means is if the camera gets the subject wrong, or if you do it a focus and then recompose, then you could end up with putting the focus point someplace else, and it may be metering as though it thought that's the subject, but it may not be the subject anymore after you have recomposed. So you have to be careful about that. So one thing to keep in mind is this idea of scene recognition, to see what kind of scene it is and recognize portraits or recognize landscapes or recognize sky. That same technology that started out as scene recognition about 10 or 15 years ago has now evolved into subject recognition. And so your camera still uses that, and it is part of helping focus on a particular type of subject. So metering issues that you run into, whatever your camera thinks the exposure is, there's one correct exposure that you're going to have. But we just went through, and there are 5 different ways of getting to that exposure, depending on which one of these you pick. And each of these could conceivably be just a little different depending on the subject, the background, the lighting on the subject, and where your particular subject, your measurement is being made. So it's driven by the area that's being metered and the weights that are being applied based on that situation. Second thing is the camera assumes everything is medium gray, neutral gray. And if the subject is extremely dark or extremely light, a white bird, a black bear, a dark brown dog, all of those things, the camera is going to adjust accordingly, because the camera thinks, oh, I'm in a really happy place. I want everything to be neutral gray. I know just what to do. But it's not always right about that. You might also have an extremely light or dark background. So think about a dark forest scene where you've got a forest area in the background, and that's darker than normal. The camera is going to look at it and say, oh, I've got a really dark area here. I need to make it brighter. I need to, even though I can tell it's a background, I need it to be a brighter background than it is. And so it may want to overexpose the image because of that. The tough one for birds in flight is when the subject is moving across different backgrounds. So it starts out just fine. You've got the exposure nailed and it's perfect. And then next thing you know, it's flying across a bright patch of sand. And now all of a sudden the camera changes the exposure. Then it flies across dark blue ocean and changes it again. And then it flies across some trees. and that background's there and it changes it still again. So you've got to deal, if you've got any kind of automated exposure, aperture priority, auto ISO, auto or program modes, all of those you're going to run into these kinds of things. Issues with the background has changed or the subject is lighter or darker. One way to deal with those is exposure compensation, the little plus or minus button on your camera or in your menu. So generally for photography, we're going to use one of two modes, either manual, and manual can be used with in full manual for all the settings, or manual with auto ISO. And auto ISO means the camera will automatically adjust the ISO as it needs to get the right exposure, or what it thinks is the right exposure. Or the other one is aperture priority. And the reason I would want aperture priority is because I'm almost always going to want to maximize light and try to have a shallow depth of field. And in both cases, the lowest aperture is probably, or near the lowest aperture is what I'm going to want. And so aperture priority is going to work. But again, it's semi-automated and I may need to use exposure compensation. Manual can be used with or without auto ISO. And if you're using auto ISO, the ISO will automatically change. And so it can, because it's looking for that neutral gray, if you will, then you may find that you need manual exposure compensation to adjust for it. So between now and Saturday, I would like for you to pull out your camera and be sure you know how to adjust using the exposure compensation button, the little plus or minus indicator on your camera or in your menu, whichever is the best way to get to it on your particular camera. So be sure you know how to find exposure compensation, because it is something you're going to need to use. So ISO is something that probably needs a little bit more attention. Essentially, ISO is something that amplifies the signal to create a balanced exposure. The aperture is a fixed opening in the lens. It's physical. The shutter speed is the amount of time the lens is open, or the amount of time it's recording data on a mirrorless camera. And so that's, again, physical. But ISO is simply the amplifier. I describe it as taking a radio station, and as you drive further away, the signal starts to fade. And so you turn up the volume a little bit, trying to be able to hear it. And that's great to a point. ISO does that. It's amplifying the signal and it's working. But then you're going to get to a certain point, and all of a sudden, that rather than just amplifying the correct information, which is the station you're listening to, it's going to start also amplifying the noise, the static that's going on in the background. That's essentially what noise is. It's static or random information that's going on in your image. And when you have noise that is noticeable or noise that is too much, then it's going to overwhelm and distract from your image. And so I'll show you an example in just a minute. So the optimum ISO is the lowest number that you can set on your camera. But there's a balance. That may not be the best ISO for the photo you're trying to make. So you may need to increase your ISO to a point. Normally, it's somewhere in the ISO 3200 to ISO 6400 level that you start to get to the point where you're kind of at the edge. And if you start going higher than that, you're getting enough noise where it becomes problematic. So here's an example of, based on cameras, what you're going to find is that there's very little difference across cameras in the ISO level and the relative performance. On the left axis here, you've got the dynamic range. And as it goes across on the axis at the bottom, you've got higher ISO levels. And what you can see is basically every time you increase ISO a little bit, you lose dynamic range in the image. And dynamic range is the difference between the lightest and the darkest areas in an image, the lightest and darkest areas that a camera is capable of capturing. So if you raise your ISO, it's kind of a negative, and it depends on how much dynamic range you need for that particular photo. Where it starts getting kind of halfway over here, ISO 3200 or so, you start having a lot less dynamic range than in a typical image because you push the ISO up a lot. And you're going to start to introduce a little bit more noise to that image as well. So let's look at noise. Just an example sometimes helps. So here's a hawk that was on my deck. Thought, okay, let's take a photo of this, but it's overcast. It's kind of a dreary day like today. I was at 1/60th of a second, f2.8, 200 millimeters is my 70 to 200 lens. And I still had to go to ISO 6400. So what does that look like? Well, this is what it looks like up close. This is a magnified view. You see all those dots around the bird? That's noise. That's what noise is. And you see the color in those dots? That's color noise. That's the type of noise that's involved here. And what you have is you have all this noise, but you also lose a little bit of sharpness in the subject itself. So I'm going to try to edit this photo. I'm going to try several ways to edit it. And these are simple examples. You also have AI-based tools now, but just to give you an idea of what happens. So this first photo is trying to edit just to the point where I can get rid of the noise. And it got rid of almost all the noise, and that's good. The problem is in doing so, it lost the sharpness in the image and the whole image is blurrier. So here's what it was before, and here's what it did to my sharpness by getting rid of all that noise. So my background's better, it's less noisy, but my subject is less sharp, and so that's not a good thing. So now on this one, what I've done is I've just tried to sharpen the image. And I haven't done anything with noise. I'm just trying to make the image of the bird's eyes, the feathers, as sharp as I can get. And that doesn't really work either, because what I've done is I've made the noise worse. So the trick is that what you want to do is you want to sharpen your subject and use a light touch. And you want to apply noise reduction to the background or everything else. So when you're editing the photo, you're trying to kind of come up with a middle ground. And this is what it looks like when you do that. The background has just noise reduction. The subject itself has sharpening. Now this is magnified. So here's what the image actually looked like. This is still a pretty tight crop, but it looks fine. So it's okay to have a little noise in the final shot, which in this case, there is a little noise. You don't have to get rid of 100% of the noise. You just have to reduce the amount of distraction there. And this is kind of what it looks like. So this is ISO 6400 to give you an idea of kind of what can be done pretty easily. But as you start raising the ISO higher and higher, you're going to run into noise and it becomes more of an issue. So here was the beginning issue, and this is the ending issue. Image rather. So cropping is one of those things that's going to make everything that's left in your image bigger. And if you've got noise in the image, it's going to make the noise bigger. So the rule of thumb is every time you crop out a quarter of the frame, that's a stop of noise. So reducing the amount of frame makes a difference. You can do that with different frame sizes. So here's an example of the difference between a full frame sensor, a crop sensor, an APS-C sensor, a micro four thirds sensor, and a smartphone. And you can see that all four of these could have the same number of pixels, but the bigger sensor is the one that is capturing the most light and it's going to have the least noise. If they all had the same number of pixels, the one with a full frame is going to have a larger pixel to be able to get there. And even if it's a little smaller, it has more of them. So this is why for low light or for noise, people tend to gravitate toward full frame cameras. It doesn't make any difference until you start getting up to higher ISO levels. That ISO 3200 or ISO 6400 it's kind of my rule of thumb. You'll have your own cutoff as to where you see it, and it tends to be seen most often, the noise is seen in the darker areas of a photo. Those are the ones that don't have a lot of photo information. So when it comes to settings, what we're looking for subject matter is a balance. I want the lowest aperture. I mentioned that earlier because I want to have the background out of focus, and I call that a clean background. I want a relatively fast shutter speed, something that will freeze the action. If the subject is perched, the rule of thumb is 1 over the focal length of the lens. So with a 400 millimeter lens, you want 1/400th of a second. With a 200 millimeter lens, 1/250th of a second or 1/200th of a second is what you're looking for at a lowest acceptable level. Now, with stabilization, you can get a little bit more out of it than that. So you can push the envelope lower still, but those are kind of your starting point. If the subject is moving, rule of thumb, 1/2400th of a second, or faster, depending on the quickness or speed of that particular subject. If it's a small songbird or swallow or something like that, that's relatively small, it's a very fast bird, you go up maybe 1/4000th of a second. If it's a great blue heron or a great egret, you might be perfectly fine at 1/2000th or 1/1600th of a second. And then ideally, ISO is what you use to balance this out. You want a moderately low ISO, but raise it if you need to. If you're going to crop, or if you feel like you're going to need to crop, put a little bit more weight on keeping your ISO down. And you won't always have enough light, so sometimes you have to adjust these below the optimum level. It's just something you have to live with and decide, how do you want to trade off? Do you want to trade off with shutter speed, or do you want to trade off with ISO? Any questions? Okay, focus. Focus determines whether the subject is in focus, and what it really is doing is it's trying to locate the single focus plane that is sharpest for that particular subject, or the place where you ask the camera to put the plane so the subject will be in focus. Adjusting focus forward or backward moves the focus plane, so it's moving it forward or backward. Depth of field determines how much looks like it's in focus in front of and behind the subject. So focus works together with depth of field. So there are a couple of technologies going on here. One is you want focus to be fast. The bird's moving, or whatever your subject matter is moving. I want to get focus done as quickly as possible. Well, for that, I use a technology called phase detect. It basically assesses the image, assesses how far away the subject is, and tells the lens, move to here, move to this one point, and we'll take the photo there. That's what a DSLR tended to use. The new mirrorless cameras use a different type of focus methodology called contrast detect and phase detect together. It's a hybrid. Contrast detect basically looks at the image, assesses how much contrast there is, and says, oh, try moving it here. And so it moves the lens element just a little bit, try and make it sharper. And then it says, okay, check again, and then move it again. And we'll do this a number of times, all in a fraction of a second, all to refine focus. But what this does is makes focus a little slower. And with the earliest mirrorless cameras, as well as live view on a DSLR, it was just a little too slow for action. But now what they've got with mirrorless cameras is a hybrid approach using the two. It's a hybrid phase detect and contrast detect. It starts out with phase detect, but then continues to refine with contrast detect. So it gets better and better. And what this means to you is if you're trying to focus on something, focus early or pre-focus to get it close, and then continue to let your camera work, continue to let it try to focus, because it will usually improve focus on the second or third photo if you're taking multiple photos. So focus settings, you've got different modes in your cameras. The one rule of thumb is if you've got a subject that is either moving or you're going to move, then you probably need to have some version of AI servo or continuous autofocus. That's what you need for a moving subject. It can be used with no problem for a static subject, but not the other way around. For a static subject, one shot or single servo or AFS are not good if the subject decides now it's going to all of a sudden start to move. So to the extent possible, I try to use AFC on the Nikon cameras or AI servo or continuous focus on other models. The AF area determines how many sensors are used to focus. And so I've got different names for that, but it's basically a single focus point, a group of focus points, or everything, depending on what it is. And my goal is to use the smallest number of sensors that I can keep on the subject. So if the bird's hard to focus on, then I'm going to use a little bit larger group. But normally I'm going to try to avoid using the entire frame because it just makes it slower. What the camera is having to do is it's having to look everywhere in the frame to see if there's a subject there, if it needs to be thinking about it to focus. Whereas if I can give it a small box in the middle of the frame, then the camera is going to be much faster to be able to focus. And so if you're struggling with focus, kind of the one thing is always keep in mind that try to use a smaller focus area and it will make the camera perform better. Then one other thing relative to focus that comes up, and you may have settings on this. Many cameras can be set for the shutter to release only after focus is achieved, and that's focus priority. And that can be the default in a studio setting where you're wanting to be sure that every image is fine. But if it fails to fire, then you don't get the shot. And often you don't have a chance or enough time to be able to do something to fix it. So what I'm looking to do is I always want the camera, when I press the shutter button, I want it to take a picture. I don't want it to wait and make sure things are in focus. I'll be responsible for whether it's or not it's in focus, but when I press the shutter button, it's okay for it to fire, and I don't want it to wait. That's what's known as release priority. When I press the shutter, the camera fires, and that's what I want the camera to do. There are two reasons. One is that way I can see my errors and maybe be able to take corrective action if I've got too many errors of a particular type. The other is that some subjects are just hard to focus on, and it may be close enough even if the camera thinks it's not quite in focus. So I'd rather have a photo that is close than no photo at all. And that's what my alternative is. So I'm looking for the camera always to fire and always to take the photo. We talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of focus accuracy. With the DSLR, all of them work in a similar manner. That if your lens is a slower lens, there may be only certain focus sensors that work and certain ones that focus better than others. The one in the dead center is the one that it's going to be most sensitive to light and contrast, and that's going to focus the best. So if you're having trouble, make sure you're using the center. You don't have to use it all the time. The others work. The other parts of the frame will work. But if you're having trouble, then go to the center, and that will often help. Another tip with all cameras is to find something that's close to your subject that you can focus on. So if it's a small bird and it's kind of ducking through some leaves and I'm having a hard time focusing on it, I may focus on a branch or a twig or something that the bird is standing on, maybe its leg, rather than the head, because I'm pre-focusing and trying to get close. Once I've done that, then the camera will refine focus or will hold focus through those leaves pretty well. But that first initial focus, sometimes I need to help it. And so I can help by pre-focusing on something that's the same distance or near the same plane, and then just let the camera refine. If what the camera sees is completely out of focus, then it's going to go until it gets something in focus, and that something often is not your subject. Choose a good focus target. And what's a good focus target? It's something with high contrast. It's got very defined edges, so avoid soft edges. I had somebody once that was showing me that his camera wouldn't focus very well, and he was focusing on the edge of an evergreen tree. You know, an evergreen tree has got all these soft branches on the outside of it. There's no edge to it. There's no precision to it. So you can focus on the tree, but I can't tell whether it's focusing on the front branch or the next branch or the next layer of branch. There's nothing for me to really be precise about. I'd much rather focus on the tree trunk than a general group of leaves or branches. I want to be very specific with a very specific target for my focus. If I need to, I can use an alternate target. I'm looking for something that's approximately the same distance. For moving subjects, especially things that are flying, I want to pick it up early in the process, focus on it first, focus from a distance, keep focus, refine focus, refine focus, refine focus. And then when it gets close enough, that's when I want to press the shutter and have it take the photo. And I may want to take a burst of photos, so it's a series. By starting early, the camera has a chance to acquire focus, and I have a chance to fix it if it's a little off. If I wait until the last minute, then the camera doesn't have a chance to adjust, and if it picks the wrong thing, then I'm out of luck. With mirrorless, it's probably a little bit more to pre-focus on the right distance, and the reason it's using the sensor, the actual image, to focus. And if what it sees is a complete blur because it's completely out of focus, then it doesn't know where to go and often ends up hunting or trying to figure out where to focus. I want the smallest focus area that I can keep on the subject. So that's usually not the whole screen, it's something smaller. And there are different modes for different cameras that will help with that. I want to have a plan where autofocus subject detection didn't work, and what do I do about it? So we were talking earlier about, okay, let me turn off subject detection, or let me get it to focus on a stick, because I don't want it to focus on, to look for eyes or patterns that look like eyes if what I'm really trying to do is focus on a tree trunk or a leaf. I want a plan to be able to turn off subject detection or turn to a smaller mode, because the best focus mode for any of these cameras is probably going to give you great results 95% of the time. Maybe it's 90% of the time, but it depends on the subject and it's going to miss some of the time. So what you're trying to do is when you run into that 5 or 10% or 2% where it's missing, what do I do? And you want to have a plan. And then finally, correctly expose the image that you're seeing through the viewfinder. We talked about that bird that's up against the gray sky and how it's really black and dark. The camera's not going to find an eye or not going to find a head if what it sees is a dark blob up there. The bird has to be correctly exposed, even if that means raising the ISO, for it to reliably focus on that subject. Now, again, sometimes it will find an eye because it catches a catch light or it has something that's an indicator. But normally, if the subject is too dark, the camera's going to start to struggle with focus. Subject detection. I think this is constantly evolving. It's fairly new. But it's in particular on the newest mirrorless cameras. It's relatively new technology. It's AI based, and it's really made a big difference. Subject detection is able to, depending on the camera, identify different types of subjects, sometimes a very wide range of subjects. But it's best when the subject is large enough in the frame. So if you've got a small bird that's 100 yards away, then it's going to have a hard time identifying them. You really mean that's my subject? But if that bird is starting to fill a quarter of the frame or a fifth of the frame or something like that, or if it's clearly identified because it sticks out and there's nothing distracting around it, then the camera is going to do a remarkably good job of being able to focus on those subjects. There is a priority that it uses with subject detection. It starts by identifying the subject, then the subject's head, and then the subject's eye. And so if at any step along the way it starts to lose track of whatever it has, it's going to fall back to the prior level. So with birds, what that means is that it's going to start out and you're going to be trying to focus on the eye, but if it can't, or it's going to start out trying to find a body. And if there is a bird associated with that, then it's going to look for the head that's associated with that bird. Once it's found the head, then it's going to try to find the eye. If the bird turns its head away and it doesn't have an eye to look at, camera's still going to try to hang on and focus on the head, even if it's turned the opposite direction. But if the head is ducked behind a tree, then what it's going to do is it's going to try to fall back on the rest of the subject. So then it's going to focus on just trying to get something on the bird. So it's just got this priority. And I say this from the standpoint of just keep in mind that the camera has got a job to do and it's doing it in this order. Is it a bird? If it is, I'm looking for the head. If I've got the head, then I'm looking for an eye on the head. Works the same way with people. Is there a person there? If so, then I'm going to find the face. And then after finding the face, I'm going to find the eye. If I lose the eye, then I'm going to go back and look for a face again. All technology is going to miss some of the time. Just have a fallback. Questions? Okay, focus tracking, we'll come back to pre-release. That's in your package. Okay, 10 reasons why images are soft and what to do. First is shutter speed's too slow. And there are several things that go on here. One is the subject's moving. And keep in mind that even though you've got stabilization to help stabilize your view, it doesn't help when the subject is moving. So the subject, what it will do is help you make a photo of a static subject. But if the subject is flapping its wings, turning its head, or like birds do, sometimes they just twitch. That's still going to be moving and it's going to give you a soft subject. So consider the impact of kind of how big that subject is and how fast it moves. A great blue heron is going to be pretty slow. You can get down at a really slow shutter speed to photograph a great blue heron. Whereas a hummingbird or a swallow or a sparrow, something like that, they're constantly moving or twitching or whatever. You're going to need a little faster shutter speed for those kinds of subjects to have it sharp. So as a general rule, at least 2,000th of a second for anything that's in flight. If you can't get to 2,000th of a second because of low light or whatever the conditions are without your ISO getting crazy high, then you might want to think about a different type of photo. Maybe it's perched or standing, or maybe it's intentionally blurring it for artistic reasons. For subjects that are walking or swimming, a duck in a pond or something like that, they can get pretty twitchy, but normally you can get away with maybe 1,000th of a second. So it's fast, but it's not as fast. And then for something still or a portrait, you start getting down as slow as maybe 100th of a second. I've actually taken photos of birds as slow as 1/15th of a second, where I was trying to blur water from a wave or trying to blur water from a little waterfall or cascade. And the bird's in there feeding, and so you're blurring the water back behind, and that requires a really slow shutter speed. If you are limited by the light level and you're having to really compromise, you can't get your shutter speed fast enough, one approach is to take a lot more photos. So assume that maybe you've got a 1 in 10 chance of getting a good photo. So what does that say? Well, that says that I need to take at least 10 to 20 photos to make sure I have a good one. Whereas if I could get a fast enough shutter speed, I might be at 9 out of 10 are successful. And 1 or 2 photos is enough. I don't have to take a lot of photos to be able to make sure I get a good one. So here's some examples. Large birds, cranes, or egrets, 1/1600th to 1/3200th of a second. Medium-sized birds, cormorants, eagles, hawks, ospreys, 1/2000th to 1/4000th of a second. And small songbirds, 1/3200th to 1/8000th of a second. You may not have enough light for that, but that's the goal. That's what you're trying for. Technique, different ways with long lenses. Ideally, especially if I'm going to be working a subject for a long period of time, if it's kind of working area, I really like having a tripod. That doesn't always work, especially not when you've got a bird walk. So some other type of support, maybe a monopod, or maybe just good technique with your elbow tucked in and your hand supporting the lens. That may work. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more before we get started on Saturday, but we'll talk about long lens technique and hand holding techniques. Another reason for blurred images, a dirty autofocus sensor. This really just applies to DSLRs. There is a sensor for focus. We all know about the sensor that's in your camera to capture the image and know that it's possible to clean that. Well, there's another sensor that's on the bottom of the mirror box, and that's used for focus. And sometimes a little dust or a little debris gets on top of that sensor, and it really has a big impact on focus. And so if you're cleaning your sensor with a blower, or if you're having any problem with focus, one of the first things you can do is just blow out the bottom of the mirror box. You want to hold the camera up with the lens opening pointing down, and just blow what is the bottom of the camera with a bulb blower. Again, on Saturday, I'll show you how to clean your camera with a blower. If you don't have a blower, then you definitely want to get one. It's an easy way to avoid having to pay for somebody to clean your sensor. Third reason for soft images is heat waves or atmospherics. This especially happens when you've got a subject that's really far away, especially if it's a bright sunny day or a very cold day. But these bright sunny days, you can see coming off the road or coming off the surface, a lot of times you see kind of ripples through the air. And those are heat waves where you can actually see the distortion caused by the heat coming off the ground. So that can lead to soft images. Haze can also limit contrast and makes an image look soft, looks out of focus. And you can even have heat waves during cold weather, even sub-zero temperature, because of the difference between the sunlit air and the surrounding air. So again, just keep in mind that when you start getting long distances, say over 150, 200 yards, if the temperature can have an impact on whether you can get a sharp image or not. Next one, I see this happen a lot. The subject is just too far away. You know that little dot way out in the distance that you're trying to photograph? Sometimes it's good for a record shot. Sometimes it's okay for identification, so you try it anyway. But it's really not going to be a very good photo from an artistic standpoint. Not going to be something you're sharing that, oh, look at this great photo I made. Your best results, even with a long lens with 100, maybe 150 yards, when you start getting outside of that, the subject's just a little too small, and you want to figure out what strategies you might have that you can get a little closer to it. Longer lenses work really well to magnify subjects, but what they won't do is completely overcome the fact that the subject's just too far. You can still take photos of those, It's just you're going to struggle from a quality standpoint. This is a little less common, but it still happens, is especially with older gear or with gear that you've used for a while. You can get dirt or oxidation on the mount, and you can, if you get enough of that on the contacts for that lens, it can affect focus. And so there is a product called Deoxit. I put this in here just because it's something that's really easy to fix. And you'd be amazed at how much grime and black stuff ends up on the mount of your lens and also on those little contacts. And so it's just something to be aware of, that if you're having a problem with a particular lens and it might be an issue with the equipment, this is a way to check it and fix it. Zooming after focusing. It's real easy to focus on a subject and you kind of get it all set up, and then you decide, well, I'm going to zoom just a little tighter. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit for better framing. When you do that, you need to reframe or refocus on the subject. While there are some lenses that you don't have to refocus after you've changed the zoom, that's really uncommon. Most lenses today, you have to, if you change the zoom, then you have to focus again. Stabilization, again, when it comes to soft images, there are two sides of this. One is you've got subject movement, which we talked about. The other is that stabilization is what's creating a vibration in your camera, and that's causing a soft image. So think about what stabilization does. It's taking either a lens element in your camera or the sensor, and it's moving it very slightly, trying to synchronize movement and stabilize the camera. And so because it's trying to move, it can create its own blur that goes with that. It can create vibration in your camera from that movement. It can also be moving it slightly at the wrong time. And so either of those things can be something that causes a soft image. The rule of thumb is, as you have faster shutter speeds, you may need to turn stabilization off. With the newest lenses, that's not always true, so it is lens specific. And it also may be in some cases camera specific. So just know your gear and check on that. Do I need to turn off stabilization at higher shutter speeds for this particular lens? Autofocus speeds. Remember we talked about focusing on something that's coming toward you in advance. One of the things that can cause soft images is the camera can't focus fast enough. You get behind, you're pressing the button a little late, the camera can't quite get focused on the subject in time, or it doesn't get really locked in. It focuses, but it's not locked in on the subject. If you give it more time by pre-focusing, then you can get close, and the last minute adjustment the camera has to make is very small. So you're able to kind of avoid some of these problems with that. Pre-focus, the approximate distance you need, pre-focused or focus early on a subject when you first see it. We talked earlier about focus. It requires contrast. If it's too dark, or if you've got your camera's exposure set too dark, the camera's going to struggle for focus. So when you're photographing a silhouette, it's hard for the camera to see what the subject is and focus on the eye. Try to get the subject a little brighter in the frame, more like a good exposure. Don't expect it to focus as well when everything's black or dark. Several sources of vibration. One that comes up that I see more often than you would think is wind. I always use a hood on my lenses, but especially with a long lens, sometimes you get enough wind where the wind is hitting the lens and grabbing that hood, and it makes it really hard to hold it steady on the subject. So what I'm trying to do, what I will do in that case is simply take off the hood if it gets to be too much. normally you don't photograph in a crosswind, but if you do, then that's something you may need to keep in mind. Lens issues, mechanical issues, lens defects are fairly rare. Every now and then you're going to have a problem with the lens itself. I remember the most expensive lens that I own was a 600 millimeter lens, and it arrived from the factory with a stuck aperture. Somebody somewhere along the way had taken this lens. They probably bumped it or put a lens cap on the wrong way and stuck the aperture level, and I ended up having to send a $10,000+ lens back to the manufacturer before I got to take any photos with it. It happens, but it is rare. Usually when you run into something like that, you can just as easily send it for repair as you can send it back to the factory and return it. It depends on what the issue is. When you get a new lens or something like that, try it out first thing, try it out outside in normal conditions and be sure that it works properly, because every now and then you will see a problem. When you see somebody looking for a good copy of a lens, they're probably overdoing it or overly picky. Usually the lenses are much more consistent than the photographers are. So you'll see some people who end up having problems over and over and keep churning through lenses. Others never have a problem. Most professionals aren't sending lenses back because they're having problems. It's not the professionals that are running into those issues. Shooting through a window. Let me show you this as an example. We're getting close to wrapping up. But I just want you to see this as an example of what happens when you're shooting through a glass. Had a hawk that perched on a fence just outside my kitchen window. It was so close, I thought, gee, let me get a photo of it, and I happened to have a lens nearby. So the first photo was of the subject 15 feet away, and it was through a relatively new window. Second photo, I went outside to see how it would look. And in this case, I was 50 feet away. And then the image here that you'll see was cropped. Just to make them look the same side for comparison purposes. So here's the example. The bird on the left was the one that was 50 feet away. And you've got lots and lots of detail around the eye, no problem at all. The one on the right was only 15 feet away or 16 feet away, was taken through a window of my kitchen. And I probably took 20 photos, and this was as good as it got. It just never really got all the way sharp, even though it was really, really close to the subject. And this was a almost brand new window. It was maybe 6 months old. It was really current window technology as well as everything else, and a good lens. So the lesson learned from this is, generally speaking, your household glass is not the same quality as the glass you have in your lens, and shooting through glass is going to cause some deterioration. Now, even worse than this is shooting through the front windshield of a car. And when you start doing that, and again, I've done it, you'll find that that's fine for one of those I saw it photos, but often it's surprisingly blurry. So if you can remove glass and get glass out of your way, especially household glass or automotive glass, it really helps, even if you have to back up to do it or take the photo from further away. So again, here's the magnified view of that pair that you saw. The one on the left is 50 feet away with nothing in between. This is from outside. The one on the right is as good as it gets from 15 or 16 feet away, but I was shooting through glass. And look, there's a huge difference in sharpness between the two of these. Okay. I've got some other things that are in the package just for you to glance over. We'll talk about some of these later. I mentioned this one earlier. wind and light from the same direction. If you can do that, then everything's just great. And so there's an app that I use for that called Windy. And I would highly encourage you, if you're going to be photographing at a beach or at the shore, to get that app and be able to check wind direction. So here's an example there from down at Jekyll Island. The wind is from the east, and so it's a perfect time to photograph at sunrise. This is what the wind and the light were coming from the same direction, which meant that every bird was facing into the wind and facing into perfect light. All I had to do was sit there and shoot. Sunrise, I was down there on the tip and it was perfect. And here are the photos. Every exposure is the same. Every subject is perfectly lit. Now at sunset, I've got the wind from the same direction. Now wind and sun are from opposite directions. That's not working very well. So I'm shooting backlit birds now because that's all I can get. The wind and the sun are coming from opposite directions. Every single shot backlit for an entire day. Now here the wind is 90 degrees. It's coming from the side. You think, well, gee, I've got a little bit of light on the side of the bird. No, because what happens here is that half the bird's in shadow. In other words, one eye of the bird's in the shadow, one's in the sun, best case. Every single shot doesn't work. And as Ember knows from wedding photography, it's really hard to make a shot work when you've got spotty light or blotchy light on the subject on the face of your subject. So in this case, wind at 90 degrees, that's kind of the worst of all worlds. There's no place I can stand to be able to make a good photo with good light on the subject, and they're all going to be facing away from me. The answer is I can go home on this one. So few more tips for great images here. I'll let you look at them on your own. Lighting, compositions, and so on. But just to give you some examples, just normal photos that come up there. So all this is in your package, and let's take a look later. We've got a few more minutes. What questions does everyone have? You can unmute your microphone. Go ahead.
Well, I know what I've been doing wrong.
That's half the battle. That's okay.
Really, though, this has been incredible, and I can't wait to get out there Saturday.
And on Saturday, just plan on being sure you ask questions and we can talk about things, because anytime along the way that you have a question, chances are somebody else has a similar question or a similar thought. We can talk about it as a group and be able to go through it. So bring all your questions. I won't know your camera. I promise you, I will not know your camera backwards and forwards. Even though I've been shooting Nikon cameras for a long time, I don't know every Nikon camera and how to get to certain buttons and certain settings. But I can tell you kind of some ways to solve it and give you some things to look at in your manual later.
You know, it's funny because I used to shoot, film. My first camera that my brother gave me, it was his camera, was a Canon FTB, and I did it on full manual. I took classes, and with the film camera, they use the term ASA, which I assume is compatible with ISO.
It is. That's exactly right.
And I always thought that, with the ASA, you want to get to like 200 or less, because anything 400 or above is going to be very grainy. So I'm used to setting ISO low, but apparently that's not the right, I've been shooting at 100 ISO, and apparently I've been missing out on a lot.
Well, maybe you're missing an opportunity to raise the ISO and raise your shutter speed at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
It is an opportunity. It's not something you have to do. I still like having a low ISO, and I'll probably bend things a little bit more personally to get down to that lower ISO level. But certainly at ISO 400 or 600 or even 800, it should be fine with just about any camera.
I can't wait to try it.
Other questions?
Eric, this is Steve. And it's more of a comment, shooting the crop sensor camera. I used to be deathly afraid of high ISOs. and I've learned to not be quite as fearful, right? And I'll shoot routinely at 6,400 above, even on the micro four thirds. As long as I'm pushing everything on my histogram to the right, I have a great chance of recovering it, particularly with the technologies we have now.
Well, Steve, you raise a really good point, because it's not the entire image that struggles with ISO. If your image is green grass or blue sky at ISO 6400, you're fine. There's not much noise at all in that. It doesn't make any difference. On the other hand, if it's a dark forest or dark shadows, there's just not much data there. And so you have to be a lot more sensitive to dark tones, which are going to have inherently less light to begin with. Unless
I totally agree. Getting as many good photons on the sensor as possible.
yeah.
And that's my experience was I was underexposing. I wasn't highest ISO was not my problem. Underexposing was my problem, particularly in the shadows. And so I learned to push everything to the right, and then it opened it up, and I had a better chance of recovering. There'd still be some noise. But
and we've talked about it with these mirrorless cameras. Your focus really improves a lot if you're properly exposed. So it doesn't have to be overexposed, but if you have your ISO down a little too low and you're not getting quite enough light, and you figure, oh, I'll fix it later if it's a little dark, well, you're giving up some of your focus as well.
Right, and I also learned to trust my histogram and not exactly what I was seeing.
Yes.
Because if you expose to the right, particularly if you do playback, it's going to look like crap. It's going to look overexposed.
Yeah.
But,
Other questions? Thank you, Steve. Other questions? Okay, we're going to meet at Blue Heron on Saturday. We're going to start at 8. We'll be in the parking lot. It's on Roswell Road in kind of North Buckhead. I can tell you from experience that Goldberg's is open if you need a bagel, and if you there's some other places to grab something to eat or coffee or whatever in the area. And we should be finished probably around 10:30, depending on weather, a little later, a little earlier. It'll be somewhere right in there. Bring your questions, and we will work on this. Will be an actual shooting session in the field. Travel is light or is not as heavy as you want. I wouldn't bring a tripod for this because we're going to be pretty mobile. But if you wanted to bring a monopod or something like that, that could be useful, especially if it's going to be overcast. Sheridan, what you have for us? Anything else?
No, sounds good to me. Yeah, we'll keep you all updated on the weather. Yeah, our call time is usually the night before 6 p.m. So if you don't hear from us by then, it's still going on. But yeah, everybody have a good evening, and we appreciate y'all being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it. Hey, Caleb.
Right.
Hey, how are you?
Thanks, everyone. That's it for
Bye.
tonight.
We'll see Saturday.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.